What are they doing? That tribe is now going to war with that tribe because they are both worshipping different statues which they claim to be me. But they're both wrong. There's another group over there who've got it right. Honestly, I will never understand these mortals. Now, let's start again. Let's try crabs.
Hello and welcome to this week's Campaign Creator. I hope you have all become aware of our new time change. We're now going to be coming out on Fridays rather than on our regular Wednesdays. We think this is just going to work better for everybody. So, my name is Guy and today we're looking at step 6 in our campaign creation series, where, as usual, I hope you go through the same process that I'm going through whilst watching this video. Otherwise, you can hit those timestamps down below in the doobly-doo to move around the video as you need to avoid listening to me prattle and waffle on. Today we are looking at a very important question, a fundamental if you like, and the basis around which most organizations and civilizations, a civilization is a polite civilization, a civilization around which most civilizations are based. We are talking about the creation myth and gods. Now, when we talk about gods and omnipotent powers within fantasy worlds or science fiction worlds, they sometimes in science fiction seem to play a little bit of a lesser role for reasons unknown. Really, it's assumed by sci-fi that, well, we've moved on from those kinds of things. I don't believe that that is true in the slightest. And if you think of things like Star Wars, there is a certain godlike appearance or at least power of the Force being all pervasive and everywhere. Anyway, the idea when we look at an omnipotent power that controls or guides the fate of the universe and how that affects others and what they expect in return for being these benevolent creators is important for us to unpack and understand. When we look at the world that we're currently creating in our campaign, the campaign called Uther's Dragons, which is now incorrect, it should be Utherios's Dragons, but we'll get there. As you are aware, things change, adapt, adjust, and grow as we discover new things around our world. We need to look at some creation myths. It is based in fantasy, and in particular the skewing, after having done the cultural breakdowns of the world map last week. If you haven't watched that episode, go and check it out. But after having done that, the world seems to be a lot more ancient and less medieval. We don't expect to see knights in heavy plate mail riding around. We now expect to see hoplites and perhaps Roman soldiers, if we're going to go that far forward, fighting alongside samurai and Vikings, which, yes, I understand completely crosses all time zones, but that's the world we've kind of ended up with. That means that the gods should be particularly important to the setting and the world that we are making. Now, from a campaign creation perspective, your players are going to want to create characters. Those characters are going to ask fundamental questions like, where did I come from? And that's not in the sort of carnal sense, it's in the biblical sense. In this case, the Biblios is being written by you. Where is this all coming from? So we're going to have to make that up. Today, we're going to be looking at how to do that, and I'm going to look at doing that for the campaign world. And I'm going to turn to Photoshop to help give me a visual aid rather than use anything else. So if you don't have Photoshop, it doesn't really matter. You can even use a piece of paper. It doesn't matter. Like I said, it does not matter. It is simply going to form part of the basis around how we create pantheons and gods and the like. And here's a hint for you. Although this is applicable whether you're creating one god or many gods or facets of gods or however it's going to be, there are other ways and means of doing this. And I think I've got one idea that's been rattling around in my head since the shower this morning that I'm going to pursue, so bear with me. Okay, so there we go. We've got our Photoshop. I'm going to create a new document, standard kind of stuff. It doesn't have to be of any particular size. It doesn't matter whatsoever. This is just for me to work around in my head rather than on paper. When we look at the function of gods, what do gods do within our world? Well, in terms of purely narrative drive, they create myths, they create legends, they create a backbone from which cultures are formed, they create perhaps a priesthood or two, there is a certain cultural influence that they're going to have, and there might be some festivals and things that come out of those religious orders and movements that happen. So there's a lot that we can mine for in terms of creating a rich, vast world that feeds into our themes. And when we look at our themes for the Uther campaign, that's certainly about greed and size is not necessarily great, and sticking true to who you are is the ultimate savior, if you like. So we can tie all of those in. That's narratively. Now, mechanically, we have to take cognizance. This is something where the narrative is important, but the mechanics are almost more important. And I very much hesitated on that word, more important, but they are. We're playing role-playing games. Now, if you're using this series for writing a book, you don't have to worry too much, although you still should. There needs to be some fundamental rules, some kind of groundwork that you operate from, and so this is still useful for you to listen to as well. When we look at the mechanics of creating deities or superpowers that float around in the world and in the universe that we've created, we must be aware of what those mechanical influences are going to have on the game. Now, we are creating Uther's dragons specifically for use in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and so that means that we have to be aware that whatever we create needs to fulfill a function that the cleric class can draw from, and we are talking domains. In Dungeons & Dragons, they talk about domains, the purview of the gods, basically. Certain gods were allowed access and had control over certain elements. Triton, for example, the god of the oceans. Everyone knows Triton. Triton was responsible for the seas and the oceans and the creatures within the seas, the oceans, the rivers and lakes and things. But he had help in the form of his daughters for ponds and sort of little bodies of water. I'm not sure if there was ever a god of water in jugs, jars, cups or other containers, but I'm fairly certain if pressed hard enough we could find someone somewhere in the lineage of the gods that was responsible for knocking over cups and things. Some sort of cat god, I would imagine. The idea is that we need to create a domain for the gods that we create so that our players, when they're creating a cleric, can say which god has the domain life, for example. And we can say, okay, well, that's this one, that one. So we have to be aware of those mechanics. We also need to be aware that if we are cutting out domains that we play our tellers, we tell our players before they create their characters. If you are going to be playing a cleric, this is what you have access to. These are not available on this planet. This planet's a black and white planet. There's no such thing as color, so therefore there's no god of the, let's say, knowledge. I don't know. There's no writing in this world, so no god of knowledge. It's up to you how you want to play it. I would always advise that if you are using an established system that has mechanics to it, that you don't break the mechanics of the system. You rather adapt and alter your narrative to fit the mechanics. I know that sounds absolutely terrible, but what it does is it forces you to be more creative in terms of, well, I really don't want the world to have a god of knowledge. Well, what if there isn't a god of knowledge? What if it's the god of I don't know, dice playing, and that god just happens to have a demigod who is responsible for keeping track of all the scores and as a result keeps track of history. There's your knowledge god, I suppose, or demigod in this particular instance. You can also decide how much you want to break down your pantheons in terms of, okay, well, we've got the father god, then we've got the junior god, then we've got a demigod, and then we've got a semi-demigod, and then we've got a semi-demigod, and then we've got a detached demigod. You can decide how far down the chain you want your pantheons to grow. There is a warning, though, and I have said this before in other videos, specifically on creating pantheons. If you make it too complex, your players will never engage with it and you will lose all of your time and effort in doing something that nobody except for yourself appreciates. Now, there is nothing wrong with doing that. If you are someone who enjoys creating pantheons that are completely intricate with he begat her and she begat him and together they got married and had a goose, you can do that. Absolutely. I'm not saying don't do it. What I'm saying is do not expect your players to go back and read and learn your particular Bible. It's not going to happen. They are going to go, which is the god that gives me the most bonuses? That one? Okay, that's what I want. Which is the one that does not interfere with my playing at all? That one? Great, I'm going for that one. Players generally use the gods as a basis to get some kind of moral compass, perhaps, unless it's for a mechanical advantage, in which case then the gods don't really focus. Good players will dive into your system and they will appreciate and they will like what you have done, but there's still also a limit to it. So I would recommend rather having less but more worked out for those less than having more and more worked out for the more, because no one's ever going to see it. What I had in my mind this morning, however, was because the world of Uther that we have created, I've now given it a name, the world is now called Gaia. The world of Gaia, what it has is a really strong amount of cultural background that I have drawn from Earth's culture. Cultures traditionally that had a lot of religious aspect to them. I'm worried that it's going to feel too much like I've just gone, Greece, there we go, we're now just reskinning you and calling you Etherios, Japan, but we're now reskinning you and calling you this, that, and the next thing. I'm worried that it's going to feel too much. So one of the things that I wanted to do, and also because my previous campaigns often involved the gods interfering a lot, I don't want any gods in Gaia. I want Gaia to be a planet that does not believe in deities, and that the deities are not there. There is no greater power floating around. There is just lots of different types of energy that characters can draw from. So I'm not now erasing all paladins and all clerics and all bards, I suppose you could make an argument for. I'm not erasing them from my world. I am not breaking the rule system. I am taking the notion of gods, that is, something that has the ability to bestow power upon someone who worships them, and I'm turning them into a different sort of name. Basically, I'm reskinning my gods, if you like. I'm only doing this because, like I said, I have done this before. I've had lots of gods. If you only want one god, there's nothing wrong with that. Something that a lot of people have said is, well, can I have one god, but they're different for each of the races? Yes, you can. There's no reason why you can't. But as George Lucas famously said, we're all looking at the same elephant. It's just we see different parts, and so we give it different names. That's an entirely valid and, I think, very constructive way to look at having a one-god system, where it is only one god, but the elves call him Theos, the humans call him Abu, and the orcs call him Gorgor. It's entirely up to you how you want to play that out. What are the ramifications of having one god versus multiple gods? Well, that's a whole different video in its entirety. You need to decide what you want to choose, but again, you need to align it. That's not necessarily the purpose of this video. Figure out what type of gods you want and then work from there. So why do I have this page? Well, because I wanted to get rid of the idea of the gods and replace them with something else. I need to figure out what it is that I am replacing them with. And I have in my head, and I don't know where it comes from, I have this idea. Now, I work visually. That's just how I work. So I had in my head this idea, and maybe it's because I've been doing maps all week. I'm not sure. Now, there was, or is, I should say, there is a game that was released called Magic the Gathering. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Magic the Gathering. It is a collectible trading card game, TCG, and it's all about the elements that make up Magic, and I kind of like that idea. But what if we took it a step further and did something like this? Now, we know about the Zodiac. The Zodiac is there are many types of Zodiac in the world. It's not like it's something that is very specifically unique to any one culture. But the Zodiac is this notion of different spheres that influence us and change us in different ways. For those of you that are curious and believe in the power of it, I'm a Libra. I look at both sides of the fence before I make them roll d20s to see which one succeeds. But I have this idea floating around in my head. What if we, instead of gods, and bear in mind, these could very well be gods, and I would still look at them in this kind of pattern. When we think of pantheons, we often think of family trees because usually there's a father god and a mother god. There's an Ut to a Neb, however you want to call them. But usually we think of them as family trees, and then each sort of god has multiple children, and each of those children are responsible for different areas. There's nothing wrong with that. I like to look at it more like the Zodiac in this sense, but I'm going to take it a step further, and I'm actually going to make it opposites. So when I look at this, I'm going to say, all right, we've got this one. I don't know what these are yet, by the way. These are just circles at the moment. I don't know what they mean. I don't know if they mean anything. They could. I'm just randomly assigning them colors. I have no particular plan. What I am thinking, though, is that if they are opposite, then I should probably do that. The opposite of green is orange. I hate orange. So there's orange. I did not do that for down there. So if the bottom one is blue, then the top one should be red. Color Theory 101 here. And that's this one. So I'm going to make you, let's say, a lightish color, and that would make you a dark color. Let's go with what have we got here? Let's go with pink. There's an interesting question. What color is the opposite of pink? I would imagine pink is made out of red and white, so the opposite of pink would be blue and white, which would be a light blue. Maybe? I don't know. Anyway, that's what I'm going with for now. So the idea is that we have these opposites, and then they're going to sit next to each other. How they're going to sit next to each other, I'm not sure. Instead of having gods, so we could have Zeus, and the opposite of Zeus would be Hades. We could have Triton, and then say Vulcan. Not that Vulcan was really the opposite of Triton, but I don't know the name of the god who was responsible for land. Anyway, we could look at it that way. I am rather thinking of how would a world where you have magic, you have the ability for priests to restore life, you have these insane individuals who can raise the dead, you've got all of these things going around. I can almost imagine that that would have a very heavy influence on how people operated in terms of which magic they felt was stronger. I fundamentally believe that as a species, as humans, we tend to try and find our favorite and then usually look for reasons why it's our favorite. There is the underdog syndrome where we look for the least favorite, but we still believe somehow, somewhere at its very core, it is better than the thing that it is fighting against, and as a result it will win. So we always like to back the winning horse. So I feel that you would probably have groups that would form around these different spheres. So the red group would be, well, the red is the best, versus the blue group and the purple group and the black group and the yellow group and the green group. I think that is something that definitely is something that would happen. Would they go to war with one another? Well, maybe. Would those groups have different names and different cultures? Yes, I think so. Am I going to include that into my world? No, probably not. I remember reading Lord of the Rings and getting awfully confused as to who Waithrendir was versus Gandalf, because I think I missed one little section of the book somewhere. So the idea that we call the god Zeus, or we call him Jupiter, yeah, or is it Ra? They all kind of the same thing, so rather just boil it down to a single name. Especially if you look at a fantasy world where there's lots of travel, far more so than traditionally is suspected of occurring in medieval time periods, or in the earlier time periods for that matter. We only have to look at today to realize that certain fundamentals are the same, from the fact that if you look at it, we know names of different things and we can see parallels, and it's only when they're completely different that we give them different names. Anyway, that's my argument. So what I'm thinking, because I quite like the idea of this clannish, cultish approach, but the cult is not we worship the god, it's we belong to this cult, which means we belong to this particular group of individuals. We are this kind of individual. So when you look at the Zodiac, you can say, well, Librans are supposed to be balanced, whereas Taurus is supposed to be, aggressive bull-like, or Leo is supposed to be lion-like, or Scorpio are supposed to be sexually voracious individuals. I can see it happening along those lines, but imagine now if on Earth we arranged ourselves so that all Librans live together, all Scorpios live together, all Aquarians live together once they've finally made up their minds to actually move. There's all kinds of interesting things that would come out of that. I don't know if there would be a huge amount of animosity, because it's not like they're stealing from each other, so we'd like a bunch of YouTubers getting together and doing collabs, but still knowing secretly that their channel's the best. Enough from me. All right, let's get on with this. So I'm looking at this red dot and I'm looking at this blue dot and I'm going, you know what? I like the idea of cults. I like the idea of warriors equally being able to belong to these things as priests would and as wizards would. I don't see why there needs to be such a huge disconnect between the arcane, the divine, the druidic magic, bardic magic, the power that a warrior has to make 20 attacks. Oftentimes there are abilities that the non-magic using classes have, which I don't think can just be brushed away with it's just their thing. Where does that come from? I like there to be some resonance throughout the whole thing. So if divine magic is the same as arcane magic, it is a different manifestation of a power that is already present in the world. It's just that priests use that particular type of magic. Call it a different harmonic. Divine magic has to, say, arcane magic, or psionics is a different harmonic again. So that's my thinking. I think it's pretty cool if we have something like the blood cult. Now, the blood cult would be something that worships indulgence. It would be passion. It would be chaos. It would be rage. It would be a warrior's calling. But I think equally it would be perhaps the calling of those who are artists and who believe that the fires of the blood, because blood is present, it's easy enough to get to, it has featured predominantly in cultures and in practices and worship before in the past, it still to a degree is looked as a differentiator as well. So, it's something to bear in mind. So we have the blood cult. The opposite of the blood cult, the opposite of passion, the opposite of being lost in the moment is being in control of the moment. It's being in control of one's passions. It's dispassion. It's looking at things from a dispassionate perspective. It's not having an emotional, it's not indulgence. It's and it's not moderation. It is the required amount and no more. I think we could call them, and these are just names for now. I think we could call it a logic cult. I know that the logicians are sitting there going, it's not logical to form a cult. Why would you form a cult? Yes, I agree. But you're also human or centaurian or whatever. The logic cult might be seen as a group of individuals who look at the chaos that the blood cult brings about and prefers to use logic and order. They prefer to use advancement. They prefer to progress rather than to get swept away in their emotions, to control their emotions. I think those two form quite a nice opposite. And although the blood cult might want to get into fights with the logic cult, the logic cult would back up and say, it's irrelevant, we don't need to fight. Let us look for ways that we can work together. Why don't you go and fight our enemies, and we will help you build better weapons to kill them. I can see that working. I can also see there being conflict with the logic cult getting tired of the blood cult always. Just calm yourself down for just a moment. I could see that being quite fun. We then, I feel, because a lot of these things stem out of experience from life. So we would have a life cult, and I think we would have a death cult. And I think those will work quite well together, a life cult and a death cult. I imagine that we would have, because I like 8. 8 for me works quite well, and I think if you've got 8 gods, I think you'll be in a pretty good spot. What about nature? Nature is about existence. So life is different from nature. And nature cults have been around for a long time, and we know why. When you are a small little tribe, you worship nature because that's the biggest, most powerful thing around you. And if you've ever gone to the ocean or to the beach and you've been hit by a wave, you will realize just how insignificant we are in comparison to the power of nature. So I think nature is going to dominate frequently. I think people who are worshippers of nature worship cycles. They understand that things change and evolve and that they grow, but there's also a fundamental that the nature is about surviving. It's about life. It's about growing. But life is only part of nature. If anything, I could see the naturalists looking at the lifeists and death cult going, well, you really are just part of us. I mean, honestly, life, death, it happens in nature. If it doesn't happen in nature, it's not natural. So death cultists, life cultists, pretty redundant, really. The life cultists obviously are going to counter by saying that the life is about a journey. It's about experience. And an animal or a plant is although it's living, it's not experiencing. It's not growing as an individual or as an entity. The death cult might say that death is not a termination. Death is about memory. If you are still in memory, have you truly died? If you are if you have contributed to society so much that you live along, look at someone like Plato, Socrates, Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great. These individuals, they live on in our memories today as much as if they were still with us, really, but just on the other side of Facebook, and they're just really bad at responding to Facebook requests and keeping us updated. But the idea is that the death cult, I don't think, would be about, the dead. I think that they will certainly fall into their area, bringing back the dead. But I think it would be about memory. It would be about making sure that you are remembered. That's the Egyptian approach to it, as well as other things. I would also imagine that it would be about futility. I think that the death cult would be about acceptance. Everything dies. Everything comes to an end. Accept that and you will be happier. So I think that's the life and death cult. So that's going to be the counter to nature. Nature is just an expression of those things. The opposite of nature. Nature finds a way. I love that quote, and I think it's brilliant. And I think the opposite of nature is void. I don't know, that's me. Void. The void. Nature needs a space to happen in. If there's no space for it to happen in, then there is no nature to occur. If there is void, nothing can occur. So that's my thinking. That's my thinking. Is that the void is about oblivion. It's about despair. It's about non-existence. I think the void is all of those things. I think the void is also about history. So whereas the death cult is about the memory, I think that's of the individual. And I think logic will also have some historical records. But I think the void cult is about, maybe it's not about history. Maybe it's not about history. It's just about oblivion and the end and nothingness. You see, the never-ending story affected me as a child. It so traumatized me, the nothing and the gamork. All right, I'm digressing, and this video is getting longer and longer and longer. So, all right, void cult. What else? Oh, well, the fundamental basics about not violating the very rule that I set out at the beginning of this video is the idea that we don't break our own rules, and part of 5th edition very much so is the elements. So we need an element. We need elemental, the elements. Now, this doesn't necessarily need to be rock or earth, fire, air, water. It could very well be. I always like to say it's earth, air, fire, water, and love, but that's just because of another movie that completely and utterly made me change my thinking. So the elements cult would be about the idea of elements. What are elements? Earth, air, fire, water, yes, but that's nothing. That doesn't help me as a worshipper. Why do I worship the elements cult? Because of fire. Yeah, but I know I can go and worship the logic cult that says fire is going to happen because when you strike this with that, fire happens. When you use magic, fire happens. Fire is going to happen. So I don't think the elements cult needs to worship. Oh, we need to worship, so there's fire. No. No. I think that elements represent existence. Traditionally, the elements were assumed to be within every single object. A piece of wood would burn because the elements it was made out of was earth and fire. And you had to release the fire element from wood to create ash, which is basically dust, which is earth. So it made a certain kind of logic to it. So I think it's about existence. That's what I think worshipping the elements is. Life is about living and experience. The elements is about existence. Existence and truth. The blood cult is nothing about truth. Life cult is not about truth. Nature is not about truth. Logic, truth isn't a factor. Logic wouldn't even recognize that there would be. Why would you lie? So everything is taken as a truth. But logic itself can be proven to be wrong and changed. Death is about the final truth, I suppose. But again, it doesn't seem to be like its thing. Void, I don't think, cares. So the elements, fire is fire, and it will never be anything else. Air is air. Water, you see, that's where it comes in. Oftentimes there is a certain hypocrisy within the pantheons and deities and things that get created. There's sometimes a very human element to them because oftentimes they are created by humans. So there is this sense of fallibility sometimes, or not, depending on your particular creation. Elements, I think, has to do with time. And not with time, with truth and existence. Fire is fire, and it will always be fire. Fire will always burn. Water is always wet, unless it's steam, in which case it's always steamy. Okay, time to move on. So what is the opposite then of the elements? What renders all of the elements untrue? What will destroy all of the elements? Well, what destroys fire? Earth. or running out of kindling, or lack of oxygen. What destroys air? What destroys air? Well, filling it up with stuff. So you get rid of it. You burn it off, I suppose. Earth. What gets rid of earth? What gets rid of mountains? Water gets rid of mountains, but time. I'm going to have a time cult because we have diviners. We have spells that do occur, that do take place and allow us to dream the future and the past. So that's what time would be. Time would be your legacy, what you're leaving behind, which is different from the memory of death. Death is about people who remember you. Legacy is about what you have done to be remembered, I think. I think those two, because they're on the lower circle, I think those two could work out quite well. So that will work for me. You've got a time cult versus the element cult. Nature, time, and logic results in elements, blood, and results in the void, I suppose. Those three would result in the void. So when we then take this back, I'm quite happy with this, actually. I think I'm gonna work with this. So when we then take it back, we say, all right, well, what is the creation myth? How did Gaia come into existence? Where did it come from? Okay, well, we have these different cults who believe in these fundamentals. These are the 8 fundamentals of the universe. The 8 building blocks, if you like, that allow for divine magic, for arcane magic, for bardic magic, for all of the other types of magic. These are the daily cults that you would belong to. You might be a member of the blood cult, but your husband is a member of the elements cult. That's fine. The two of you can work together quite well. I would imagine that there would also be dating services, clay tablet type profiles, where one would be able to look and you'd have all of those things. Oh, the opposites attract. The death cult should marry the life cult for a life of happiness. Oh dear, no, definitely not, I don't think. Although logic could possibly work with anybody else, but ultimately they'd only really be happy with themselves. Or perhaps with the death cult, who are all about, what did we say the death cult was about? Futility. Logic is futile to a certain degree. It is logical and futile to resist. So death and logic might work quite well together. The time and logic might work well together. Although the logic people would say, well, why do you need to be remembered? What sort of legacy do you need to leave behind? And since you cannot know your destiny, it's irrelevant. Okay, so look, the logicians are basically just a bunch of party poopers, let's be honest. But you get my thinking. Now, if these were just gods, I could replace these names with gods, and instead of the blood cult, we could have a god who was about passion and seduction and war and the like. We could have, say, someone like Mars from the Roman pantheon. There's a life, Athena, perhaps god, or Bast, the goddess of home, from Egyptian. So we can replace that. The idea is that we now have these cults. The cults say that the world of Gaia was brought into existence because these 8 elements, these 8 building blocks of the universe came together to form the world, to form the space in which they coexist. And they are all present, so they all have a right to be there, and that one can worship one particular one to influence it. And I think that's the bottom line, is that they can be persuaded. Life all around creates this energy that we can tap into. Even the void, it creates a certain energy. So now I can then take it and go, okay, well, what are my various domains that I have to worry about? And I can now assign those domains, those cleric domains, and say, okay, well, there's knowledge. Knowledge goes to, I think we said it was going to be logic, or perhaps, logic, I think, makes the most, or life, because life was about experience, and you gain knowledge through experience. So maybe knowledge falls into the life cult. So when I then write these up, and I'm not going to go through that with you, but when I then write these up, I will then add in the domains that the life cult has access to are these domains. The domains that the nature cult has access to are these domains. I will also indicate roughly the classes that align to those cults. So if you are let's say you're a hoplite, you are a standard soldier, you use a long spear in combat, and you are someone who is all about the art of combat, you might worship the logic cult, learning where to stab, how to move around the battlefield. If you are more of a barbarian class character, you might worship the blood cult more. Or perhaps it's the nature cult, so you can get in touch with your inner feral ferret. Something along those lines. If you're a mage and you're a diviner, the time cult would seem to be the one that you would want to worship the most. So there's no fundamental value for casters and for characters who don't necessarily have powers that they can draw on from a mechanical perspective. But I feel that if I now have a monk who is misty stepping out of the way, if that monk happens to be a monk of the void, they are drawing on the void energy that surrounds this entire planet that caused it to come into being. They're tapping into that void energy because they're part of the void cult. It's not to say that if you are a void cultist, you can't tap into the nature cultist power. It's just to say that you are more attuned to the void cult than you are to nature cult. Just as in the most role-playing systems, if you worship one god, that's not to say you don't recognize the other god's existence. And you could, in theory, try and pull from them, but your power is fundamentally coming from the one god. So we've now got a pantheon. Yay! So we're going to put this pantheon into place. And what we're going to do is we're going to then try and break those pantheons down later on into different steps. But for now, fundamentally, once we have identified each of these cults, we're going to create a separate page entry for each of them. Using whatever software you happen to use. I have got World Anvil ready and waiting for me to add it in. It would be added in as an organization. So we would add in the organization of the blood cult. And we start to work through that and say, okay, well, these are the tenets of the blood cult. These are the domains that the blood cult provides access to. These are the classes that predominantly worship the blood cult. These are what blood cultists are called. I hate the idea of calling them bloodies. It just sounds terrible, but it was recommended by a friend of mine from Australia. Oh, you're the bloodies? Yeah, no, bloody. It just sounds terrible. So the blood cult, whether that has a specific name or whether we just call it the blood cult for simplicity's sake, for players to be able to remember, oh, they're from the blood cult, rather than, let's say, the Pleletti, and you go, you're Pleletian? What are the Pleletti again? Whereas if you just say blood cult, yes, nature cult, time cult, it's not as flavorful, but it might be more accessible. Unless we can come up with names that sit very well. So we could always refer back to looking at our good old Latin. So the time cult would be the cult of temporalis, perhaps. I'm not sure. Anyway, that's something to think about. That's something for you to go through step by step. If you do want me to do more of a breakdown on the pantheons, then please let me know. But for now, you should be able to fill in this information roughly. And then there is no need for you to work out, did the blood cult and the life cult give birth to the death cult? We don't need that. If you are creating a full pantheon, though, and you want to do a full family tree, that's fine as well. Work out the relationships between them all. What we can do, and this is something that you will need to do if you are doing a full pantheon, is work out the relationships between them. In this case, I have said that they are a homogeneous whole. They have come together, and that the people don't believe that they might believe that there are very powerful beings out there, but that these spheres have come together to create a singular whole. I don't exclude the idea of demons and angels, not because those demons and angels don't have a god to serve anymore, but they might be representatives from those different spheres, which may very well be different planes of existence. And those planes, when you take those spherical planes and you wrap them around one another, you get the prime material plane, but when you go into each of them, you might get angelic beings that come from the life cult plane, which arguably would be the divine plane, perhaps. You've got the abyss, which could be void, etc., etc. So there is that alignment. It is, like I said, a reskinning. It is something for you to bear in mind if you are going to change those names. So Hades as opposed to maybe Abyssal. What would they speak in Hades? Stygiosian? I don't know. That's up to you. Anyway, good luck creating your pantheon. Good luck having fun with it, looking at it from different angles. Don't overcomplicate it, please. Your players will not give it as much appreciation as they should, unless you have got wonderful players, in which case please remember to thank them for being amazing players. I was so impressed the other day. One of my players in one of my games had read the primer I had written for the world that I created and was spouting it back to me. It was just so, it was a reward. It was like, oh, you actually read the thing. You actually cared. It was very, very fulfilling and very, very satisfying as well as a creator. Go as far as you want to go. Anyway, yep, that's it from me this step. Once you've got your gods in place, what's next? Well, I'll tell you what's next. Next is where we take our world and we start to bring it to life with organizations such as kingdoms, cultures, and all sorts of wonderful things. So come back next week when we look at that. Until then, a big shout out to all of my Patreons. Thank you for supporting this channel. You really do make it possible. And I do thank each and every one of you. And will hopefully meet you all at some point, since I'm traveling all over the world this year. Until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of campaign creation.